Last night, the Republican-led House in Tennessee voted to expel two Democratic lawmakers who halted proceedings last week to join protesters demanding gun control legislation after the shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville. The chamber voted 72-25 to oust Representative Justin Jones, a 27-year-old community organizer elected in November to represent part of Nashville, and 69-26 to expel Representative Justin Pearson of Memphis. Republicans did not have enough votes to remove Representative Gloria Johnson, a former teacher from Knoxville who lost a student to gun violence.
The three lawmakers did not immediately respond to messages from the Washington Post seeking comment after the votes. Here's CNN This Morning's Don Lemon speaking with one of the ousted lawmakers. Let's listen.
Talking about Jeremy Faison. He's a Republican caucus chair in the State House. Last night, he did an interview with my colleague, Caitlin Collins, and he said he was wondering why you haven't apologized. Let's listen, and then we'll get your response.
I'd like to add to y'all, they've not backed down from that either. You know, I told them earlier today, I feel like if they would have said, you know what, we messed up. I mean, what American, what human won't bring forgiveness and redemption? But they've doubled down and went so far as to stand in the well today and said, I'd do it again.
I mean, you haven't apologized? What is your response to that?
I mean, I think Representative Faison needs to reflect on his own actions as a representative. Earlier this year, last year, Representative Faison pulled down the pants of a referee because he got mad at a basketball game. And he's still in Republican leadership, not expelled, not sanctioned in any way. And so for him to tell us to apologize for standing up for our constituents, I told the speaker and I told that body yesterday that I would apologize when they apologize to the families in Covenant and in the mass shootings across this nation, particularly in our state.
So let's back this up a little bit. Of course, the context of all of this is that after the Covenant shootings, which resulted in the deaths of 6 people, 3 children, 3 adults, there were massive walkouts by students in Tennessee in protest of there not being stronger gun legislation. The shooter in that case was known to have mental health issues. Their parents did not want them to have a gun. They did not believe they had a gun at the time, and there are no red flag laws in in Tennessee, regardless, that would have flagged the shooter as somebody with mental health issues from whom who should not be allowed to legally buy a gun as they were able to do. So that is the context of the protest. Now, these legislators went out and stood with the students as part of the protest. We're using the megaphone, we're using their voice in the legislative hall. And for this, apparently, they were expelled, which is a relatively unprecedented action. I think the last time this happened was over 100 years ago, and it was over a legislator having taken a bribe or something that was much more obviously illegal or wrong, as opposed to these subjective questions here about whether or not their behavior in standing with students and standing with protesters in this legislative space was inappropriate. So what do you make of this?
So first of all, I think we need to have one standard, whatever it is, we need to have one standard for whether this kind of behavior is an insurrection or democracy, because these protesters grappled with cops, they forced their way onto a legislative floor, and then these 3 legislators stood with those protesters. Now, 2 of them, the 2 who were expelled, were on the bullhorn and yelling on the legislative floor. And these distinctions apparently mattered because there were 3 different votes, as you said in the lead up, Bree, that Jones was expelled by 72 votes, Pearson by 69. The threshold here is 66. It's 2/3, right, of the legislature. And then a 3rd legislator, Gloria Johnson, the vote failed 65 to 30. So she kept her seat and not expelled by just 1 vote. But I think we need one standard for this behavior. Now, admittedly, it's not as violent, but there were physical altercations. There's video of physical altercations between cops trying to keep people off the property of the legislature and the floor, and people pushing through. So whatever we want to call this kind of behavior, I think we need one standard.
So I do think the word insurrection is used because protesters were going to the Capitol with the purpose, this is the argument, of preventing Joe Biden from being certified as the President of the United States of America.
But these protesters were going to the floor to prevent normal course of legislative
that's fine.
actions. Just which because it was the same way on January 6th, right? This vote to certify the election. That was like, to me, this is very similar, albeit of less perhaps consequence in terms of what actual legislation is pending and what vote is pending. But it's the same procedurally.
Yeah, but you brought up the word insurrection, and I think that goes specifically to the idea of trying to usurp the democratically elected leader of a country, which was not what was at stake here. So if you are saying broadly speaking, we need to have one standard for protest, I think there are a lot of different factors that could differentiate the pushing that happened. Allegedly, I haven't seen the particular instances that you're talking to, but I grant you that the pushing that happened in Nashville versus the level of violence that I think we've all witnessed happened at the Capitol, the level of property destruction, the breaking down the windows and forcing your way in. A woman was obviously shot at the Capitol. There were people who had various implements that they had brought with the intent to use them, as weapons and the like. And I don't mean to make a referendum on that. I frankly think a lot of folks would support even what happened at the Capitol if they thought it was a sufficiently legitimate underlying cause. I think what is the question here is whether or not these two legislators, who as far as I understand haven't been accused of any of that behavior, and who were, unlike I think what at the Capitol, I think this is a public space where people were allowed to come, whether or not two legislators who stood with protesters about this gun legislation that had impacted their communities, including this one legislator, Gloria, who was not expelled, actually lost a student themselves, whether or not the consequence of them standing with these student protesters should be that they're expelled from their positions as legislators. I mean, what do you make of that? Even if you disagree with their behavior, even if you think that they should be censored in some way, should this kind of like ultimate punishment be doled out against your political enemies because you disagree with their behavior in this instance? Does their behavior arise to that level in your view?
I think so. They stopped the order of, if we're going to talk about like halting democracy, right? They stopped the order of the body. And I think that is perfectly reasonable. Actually, I'm glad to see Tennessee Republicans actually take this aggressive step because oftentimes Republicans will, maybe it's the apology thing. So oftentimes Republicans, I think, will not respond tit for tat for these kinds of things. And I actually think the only way out is through until I think like sort of returning to a more civil politics won't happen, one, until the underlying divisions on issues like this comes closer together. And I think that, is sort of that's for the foreseeable future not going to happen.
Well, I actually think there's a great deal of uniformity around issues like red flag laws and people with mental illness not getting their hands on weapons. I mean, do you think that's a divisive issue in Tennessee to put forward the question, should people with known mental illness whose own parents think that they should not have a gun be able to legally access a gun? Do you think that the disconnect here is that most citizens of Tennessee want someone like the Nashville shooter to be able to access a gun?
I think so I'll take the two things separately. One, if that's your view, then they should have proposed legislation and not shut down the operation of the chamber.
Well,
because that's what is issue here. But like that would be the political way to resolve that question. But second, the reason
to be clear, they didn't shut down the operation of the chamber. My understanding is there was a delay because they came out to join these protesters. But go ahead. They did not want
the regular
there to be
order of business by force. I mean, that's what happened. And so in any case, the second piece, I think that would be the political venue to resolve that, would be in that legislative chamber through the normal order of business to propose, for example, a red flag law, right? And so the second thing on the red flag laws themselves, again, I think this is one of those things where ordinary Americans would actually be able to solve this problem. There are polls that show that majorities of Americans support this idea. Obviously, I think nobody wants somebody who has a avowed mental health history, who is very likely to pop off and do something. It seems like with every one of these shooters, by the way, there's 50,000 red flags, often ignored by multiple law enforcement agencies, and so on. So I think that's something that actually we could come to an agreement on, but for the underlying divisions between left and right in this country, because fundamentally, Republicans, and I'm with them on this issue, people who support gun rights in the Second Amendment do not trust that those red flag laws will be applied without regard, for example, to politics. And then there's a question of like, if you went, to get anti-anxiety prescription one time to a therapist, does it count as a mental health issue? Like these actual sort of hashing out of this, I think people who support the Second Amendment look at this and say, no, this is just a prelude to a larger gun ban. This is going to be implemented as a larger gun ban, and they just don't have the trust that it's going to stay on that very narrow issue.
So is there anything to be done at all about someone like the Nashville shooter who had all of these red flags? I mean, on one hand, I think you're right that so many red flags are often, in retrospect, ignored when we see instances of these shootings. On the other hand, you're bringing up the slippery slope argument that if we start looking at mental illness as a way to preclude folks from getting access to guns, and that's going to be weaponized against folks to dramatically limit people's gun rights. Now, obviously, there are many states, maybe about half the states, that do have red flag laws. It doesn't seem that slippery slope does not seem to have occurred in those states. Mississippi's rate of gun violence has basically doubled over the last, I think, 10 years or so. And people are looking to have real solutions here. So those countervailing interests that you just described, do you imagine that anything can actually be done about it in the face of a horrific tragedy like the one we've just seen in Nashville?
I think plenty can be done about it, especially when you talk about gun violence more broadly. I just think that people disagree about what to do about it, right?
I mean, but that's
when you
what
talk about gun violence more broadly, we have a whole conversation about crime and spikes in crime. When you're talking about gun violence doubling in Mississippi, that's a question of public order and crime. But setting that aside for a moment,
but this is the question. Issue. Yeah, there were 6 people who were killed. And these students in Nashville, I really don't want to lose sight against. All those kids walked out of school, which is also a violation. I don't know, should they be expelled from school? They violated school policy. They walked out. Okay, these kids who are tired of seeing their classmates murdered, they're tired of having to do these gun drills and having their parents buy them bulletproof backpacks and all of this. This is horrific. This wasn't how I grew up. They walked out of school and walked to the State House to demand, to ask, to beg their legislators to do something about this issue. Some of the legislators, 2 relatively young men who probably have a closer experience to those kids than certainly I do, stood with them outside. And as a consequence, they were expelled from the legislative body. Now, instead of taking a vote on a red flag law, instead of addressing the substantive concerns of all of those students there, it seems to me that what the legislative body chose to spend their time on was voting to expel the people who stood in solidarity with so many of these constituents. Maybe they're not voting constituents yet, but so many constituents who are directly affected by something like whether or not the Nashville shooter can legally go out and purchase a gun despite there being all of these red flags about their mental health history.
I think the frustration is it's so predictable which solution will be advanced as the mainstream solution, and depending on the characteristics of the shooter and the situation. That's what's frustrating. I don't think anybody is lacking in sympathy and frankly, like the sense of tragedy. I think people understand that this is a horrible issue. The difference is a lot of people, myself included, don't believe that gun control laws will actually solve this problem. And we're not allowed to have a broader and deeper conversation. I mean, personally, for example, I think this is an iteration. So in the 90s, we had serial killers as a sort of media phenomenon. Before that, we had the cult era in the 1970s, sort of Manson-esque cult, and that was all constantly in the media. There's a huge element of copycatting, and there's actually some study evidence to the extent that the media is actually fueling copycat of these kinds of school shootings. And then finally, we haven't once mentioned the fact that the underlying health issues that we're talking about and mental health issues also include this woman being transgender and believing that she is the opposite sex. And if we want to talk about red flag laws, I think you're going to have to talk about whether you think that's an inherent mental health condition to believe that you're the opposite sex, and whether that should preclude you from owning a gun. Now, I don't believe in the red flag laws at all, but I think that if that's a fair question.
I don't. but people, of course, can believe that if that is their choosing. It's also worth noting that the two, there was an ongoing conversation about whether or not the two men that were expelled, of course, they were not the only two that were standing with these protesters. This third legislator, Gloria, mentioned, has been making the case, and as many others have online and elsewhere, that the reason that she was not expelled and that vote just to expel her narrowly failed was because of racism. I believe we have a clip of her making this argument on the news. Let's take a look.
Why were those two expelled and you weren't?
Well, I think it's pretty clear. I'm a 60-year-old white woman, and they are two young black men. In listening to the questions and the way they were questioned and the way they were talked to, I was talked down to as a woman, mansplained to, but it was completely different from the questioning that they got. And this whole idea that, why, that you have to almost assimilate into this body to be like us.
So what do you make of her argument that she perceived herself to be treated differently than her colleagues despite engaging in the same behavior?
So I honestly think she's being completely cynical on this. When you look at what the argument she actually made during the vote to expel, she said, actually, I didn't do things the same way that they did. She made a differentiation between herself and her other two colleagues. For example, she said, quote, I never yelled versus they did. And then she also said that she didn't grab the bullhorn. So there were distinctions while they were discussing the issue of whether or not to expel each one of these people. And I think that's backed up by the fact that the votes were different. So there were 3 votes difference between Jones and Pearson. It just happened that the 4 votes different between Pearson and Gloria made the difference. Sorry, Pearson and Johnson made the difference between expulsion and not expulsion because it flipped right over that 66 vote threshold. So I frankly find this kind of cynical because she herself differentiated her actions in her own defense from her 2 colleagues on the floor, and then now turned around, went on CNN and made this argument about racism.
Yeah, I think that it's not entirely clear that that was the driving force here. Although I do think that an outcome where 3 people who substantively, if the charge is that you disrupted proceedings, that your actions, if you look at the actual vote, it was about people crowding the podium and doing all of these things that are officially apparently against the rules, and that Gloria also engaged in. An outcome where one person who meets the metric of kicking out the other people stays in by 1 vote and the others are kicked out doesn't really say to me that this is a policy that is being well tailored to actually addressing what is the purported underlying bad action here. Moreover, I think one of the men who was kicked out, I forget which it was that we were watching earlier, Jones or Pearson, mentioned that there have been other members of this legislative body who have behaved in ways that are also censorable, like pulling down a coach's pants in public. And the question is, if this really is about the integrity of the legislative body and behavioral censorship and as respecting norms and the like, is this a weaponization of their power to kick people out of a legislative office that isn't really about principle? It's really about flexing power when these Republican legislatures are facing a very angry bipartisan public, frankly, and these really large and significant protests from students who frankly have a claim that a lot of members of the public have a lot of sympathy for because they're simply scared for the safety of their kids. And I don't want to fail to mention the 3 educators who were also killed in that horrific shooting.
So I think there's a distinction between the behavior of legislators outside of the legislative body and outside of the legislative process. That, I think, is completely a matter for voters, right? Whether they want to reelect someone who pulled down the coach's pants in public is up to the voters in the same way that we talk about this in the national election and with regard to Trump's behavior or Hillary's behavior or Biden's behavior, right? That is something that is appropriately decided by voters, whereas the order and procedures of the body, I think, of the legislative body itself are a wholly separate issue. But in regards to this racism charge, I really, what do you think about the argument that even between Jones and Pearson, there was a 3-vote drop-off, which to me indicates there's a 3-vote drop-off between Jones and Pearson, and then a 4-vote drop-off between Pearson and Johnson. To me, that indicates a body that, by the way, this is only, I think, Jones was the fully partisan vote. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I'm like 98% sure about that. That Jones's vote was the only fully partisan vote. In other words, 3 Republicans flipped between Jones and Pearson, and then another 4 Republicans flipped between Pearson and Johnson. To me, that indicates a body that's actually considering the individual actions of each member, and that Representative Johnson's actions just apparently did not. It convinced one fewer of her colleagues that they were inappropriate.
Yeah, as I said, I don't know that I think that the racism claim is that strong. It's worth noting that the Nashville council members, these people might be reappointed. At least one of the expelled members has kind of a verbal acknowledgement from members of their local council that they will be reelected, renominated rather, to their old seat. What basically happens is that they can be renominated by their local council to the interim position until there is a special election at a later date, which is not yet set. So at least one of them is likely to very soon be back in their seat. The other one has had one member of their council come forward saying that they support reappointing him to his seat, but we haven't heard from the other members of his council, so we'll have to stay tuned and continue to follow that story. More Rising right after this.